The eviction notice was printed in bold red letters, impossible to ignore. Final warning. Julia Scott had 3 days left. She pressed the paper against her palm, feeling its weight in a way that had nothing to do with the ink or the cheap, flimsy material. Her landlord had already stopped pretending to be sympathetic. He had bills, too, he reminded her. A business to run. If she couldn't make the rent, he had someone else lined up who could. No hard feelings. No hard feelings. Julia nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. The fridge was nearly empty. The power bill was overdue. And Ethan, her 7-year-old son, her entire world, was still too young to know what it meant when the water suddenly turned ice cold in the middle of a shower, or why his mother sometimes skipped dinner. She needed money. Now, the city didn't care about single mothers barely scraping by. The world didn't hand out second chances. She had learned that the hard way. Then, like some cruel joke from the universe, a job fell into her lap. A cleaning gig at one of the most prestigious office towers in New York. The pay was low, but it was something. The name on the contract meant nothing to her at first. Lucas Reed. It wasn't until she heard the whispers, the way people said his name like it belonged to a man who could buy and sell empires with a single phone call, that she realized who he was. Billionaire, visionary, ruthless. He built his fortune from the ground up, turned a failing investment firm into an untouchable financial empire. His name was on everything, from tech startups to real estate developments to the kind of high-profile deals that made headlines. And now, she would be working in his world. The first time she stepped into the building, it felt like entering another planet. Every surface gleamed. The air carried a scent that wasn't quite identifiable, but screamed money in a way she had never experienced before. No one noticed her. That was the way it worked in places like this. People like Julia didn't exist in the world of Lucas Reed, and yet fate had a way of twisting things in ways no one saw coming. Because 3 weeks into the job, while dusting the bookshelves in an office she had been told never to enter, she found the photograph. At first, it didn't register. Just another framed memory-gathering dust, tucked behind a row of legal books. Then her gaze settled on the man standing beside Lucas Reed. The breath left her lungs in a sharp, silent exhale. The face in the photograph was one she had spent years trying not to forget. Mark, Ethan's father. Her fingers hovered over the frame, 100 thoughts colliding at once. This had to be a mistake. She hadn't heard Mark's name in years. He had vanished before Ethan was born. Disappeared into thin air, leaving nothing behind but a few scattered memories and an ache that never quite faded. Now, here he was, immortalized in a photo next to one of the richest men in the world. The pieces didn't fit. She should have put the frame back. She should have walked away. Instead, she stared, heart pounding, a whisper of something dark curling around the edges of her mind. Lucas Reed wasn't just another billionaire. He was connected to Mark. And whether she liked it or not, that meant he was connected to Ethan. She had spent years shielding her son from the past, from the truth. But the past had just come crashing into the present. And it wasn't done with her yet. The photograph haunted her. Julia went home that night with her mind tangled in knots, replaying the same question over and over again. How the hell did Lucas Reed know Mark? She should have let it go. Should have shoved the thought deep down with the rest of the things she didn't have the luxury of thinking about. But some truths didn't let you ignore them. Some things had claws. Ethan was asleep when she got home, curled under a blanket with his favorite book resting on his chest. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone, debating. There was no one to call, no one who could give her answers. Mark had vanished from her life before Ethan was born. No explanation, no warning, just a sudden absence that left a hole nothing could fill. She had stopped asking why a long time ago. But now she wanted answers. She needed them. The next day at work, she moved carefully, as if the air in that office had changed overnight. Every step she took past Lucas Reed's door felt heavier. She shouldn't have looked at that damn photo. Lucas was just a name, just a boss she never saw. A billionaire so far removed from her world that he might as well have been fiction. But now, he was something else. Someone else. She caught herself studying him from a distance, watching the way people reacted to him, the way his presence turned rooms silent, the way power clung to him like a second skin, Lucas Reed was a man who knew things, and Julia needed to find out how much he knew. She lasted 3 days before she made a mistake. A simple one, really. She lingered. Instead of sweeping through the office like she usually did, staying invisible, she hesitated near his bookshelf again, her eyes flicking toward the spot where the photograph had been. It was gone. Her stomach twisted. That meant he had noticed. And Lucas Reed did not seem like the kind of man who missed details. She turned, already planning how she would brush it off if anyone asked. But then, what are you looking for? The voice hit her like a gunshot. She hadn't heard him come in. Lucas was standing by his desk, eyes locked on her, his expression unreadable. She scrambled for an answer, but it didn't matter. He already knew. She could see it in the way his gaze sharpened, the way his head tilted slightly. Sorry, she muttered. She didn't get to finish. Have you worked here long? He asked, cutting straight through her excuse. Her throat dried. No, she answered, keeping it short, not trusting herself to say more. Lucas nodded slowly. Then, with an almost deliberate casualness, he moved toward the bookshelf. His hand rested on the empty spot where the photo had been. I had a picture here, he said. A test. Julia stayed still, heart hammering, pulse loud in her ears. She hesitated. I noticed it while dusting. Lucas studied her. Is that all? There was something about the way he asked it, something in his tone that made her want to run. Instead, she forced herself to nod. A long, stretched-out silence settled between them. Lucas didn't break eye contact. Then, without another word, he turned away and pulled out a folder from his desk, already done with the conversation. Dismissed. Julia left the room, head spinning, hands clenched. She wasn't imagining things. That moment, it meant something. And now she was sure of one thing. Lucas Reed knew exactly who Mark was. And maybe, just maybe, he had always known. The feeling didn't go away. Julia tried to shake it, tried to push past the encounter like it hadn't happened, like she could pretend Lucas Reed wasn't paying attention to her now. But she felt it. A shift. Like a thread had been pulled, unraveling something she wasn't meant to see. Lucas didn't speak to her again after that day, but she knew he was watching. It wasn't obvious. He was too calculated for that. It was in the way his gaze flicked toward her when she entered a room. The way conversations near her seemed to drop in volume when he was around. He was trying to figure something out. And so was she. Because the truth was, she wasn't done looking for answers. She told herself to leave it alone. She had a job to keep, a son to care for, bills to pay. And yet, every night, when Ethan was asleep and the apartment was silent, her mind went back to that photograph. To Mark. To the way Lucas had reacted when she mentioned it. Mark had always been a mystery. Even when they were together, there were things he wouldn't talk about. Places he had been, people he had known. Julia never pushed, because back then, she didn't need to. She had believed he would tell her when he was ready. And then he was gone. No goodbye. No explanation. No closure. Now, standing in the middle of a billionaire's office building, staring at the remnants of a life she had barely begun to understand, she realized she had spent years pretending not to care about the answers. Maybe she was lying to herself. Maybe she always had. Then one day, something changed. She had barely set foot inside the building before someone stopped her. Not security. Not her supervisor. It was him, Lucas. In the middle of the lobby, in front of a dozen employees who immediately pretended not to be listening. Come with me, he said. Not a request, a command. Julia could have refused. She could have walked away, feigned ignorance, acted like she didn't feel the weight of whatever was happening. But she didn't, because she wanted the truth just as much as he did. He led her into his office, closed the door behind them, and turned to face her. The silence stretched. Then, who are you? The question hit like a slap. Julia stiffened. You know who I am. Lucas shook his head. No, I don't. The way he said it, flat, measured, almost careful, sent a ripple of unease through her. You've been watching me, she said. I have. No hesitation, no attempt to deny it. She should have been afraid. Instead, she stared him down. Why? Lucas exhaled slowly, like he was weighing something, deciding just how much to give away. Then, finally, you looked at that photograph like you knew him. She didn't answer. Do you? Her fingers curled into fists. She could lie. She could say she didn't know what he was talking about, walk out of there, pretend none of this mattered. But it did. So she told the truth. Yes. Lucas didn't react. Not at first. Then, after a long pause, how? Her heart pounded. She forced the words out. He was Ethan's father. Silence. A still, sharp kind of silence that stretched so long she thought he might never speak again. Then Lucas took a slow step forward, his gaze locked onto hers. Say that again. Julia swallowed hard. You heard me. Another beat. Then, that's not possible. The words were quiet, but they weren't a denial. Not really. And for the first time, Julia realized something else. Lucas Reed wasn't just trying to figure her out. He was trying to solve something. Something that had haunted him long before she ever set foot in his building. Mark's disappearance. The past they both thought had been buried, and the truth neither of them had seen coming. Lucas didn't move, didn't blink. The weight of her words settled between them like a live wire, thrumming with something dangerous. He wasn't denying it. That was the part Julia hadn't expected. She had thrown the truth at him like a grenade, waiting for the explosion, the disbelief, the cold dismissal, but it didn't come. Instead, Lucas just stood there, silent, his mind working through something unseen. Then, finally, when? The word carried too much weight, too much meaning. Julia exhaled slowly. He left before I even knew I was pregnant. Another silence. She watched him process it, watched the gears shift behind his gaze. Then he nodded, just once, like he had come to a conclusion she wasn't a part of. Sit down, she almost laughed. Why? He didn't answer right away. Then, carefully, because I need to tell you something. Julia stayed standing. Lucas watched her for a moment before speaking. Mark didn't just disappear. She froze. His voice was steady, but there was something else underneath it. Something jagged. He didn't walk away from you. His words faltered for a fraction of a second. From Ethan. Julia's heart pounded. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. What are you saying? Lucas exhaled sharply. There were things Mark never told you. Things he never told me either. But I started putting them together after he died. She flinched at the word. Died. Mark wasn't missing. Wasn't just gone. He was dead. Her breath caught, but Lucas kept going. I knew something was wrong before it happened, he said. I knew he was in trouble, but he wouldn't tell me what it was. Julia's pulse roared in her ears. He called me a week before, Lucas continued, his voice lower now, more controlled. Told me he had to disappear for a while, that if anything happened to him, I needed to let it go. Her stomach twisted. Let it go. Mark had known. He didn't just vanish, Lucas said. He was running. Julia felt like the floor was slipping out from under her. Running. From what? Or who? Lucas watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. I don't know everything, he admitted. But I know this. Mark didn't leave because he wanted to. He left because he had to. Julia felt something rise in her throat. Grief, anger, confusion, all of it tangled together. For years, she had told herself not to ask questions. That Mark had left because he wanted to. That whatever his reasons were, they didn't matter. But now, standing here, hearing this, it mattered. It mattered more than anything. Lucas hesitated before speaking again. I've spent years trying to find the truth. Julia's gaze snapped to his. Years. He had been looking too. She swallowed hard. Did you? The question hung between them. Lucas was quiet for a long time. Then, no, a beat of silence. Then, but I'm about to. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Julia didn't know what terrified her more. The fact that Lucas had spent years searching for answers, or the certainty in his voice when he said he was about to find them. This wasn't just about Mark anymore. It was about who had been chasing him. And why. Lucas leaned against his desk, arms crossed, gaze locked onto her, like she was a puzzle he was still trying to solve. You didn't know, he said, almost like he was confirming it to himself. She shook her head. Not about any of this. His expression darkened, and for the first time, she saw something close to regret flicker in his eyes. I should have found you sooner. The words landed like a punch. Julia wanted to be angry, wanted to throw something back at him. Like what? You show up after all these years and fix everything? But she didn't, because the truth was she had spent years not wanting to be found. She had let herself believe the simplest version of the story. That Mark left, that he never looked back. That whatever love they had shared, whatever promises they had made, meant nothing. But that wasn't the truth, and now the truth was unraveling at a speed she couldn't control. Lucas exhaled sharply. I need to ask you something. Julia braced herself. Ethan. The single name made her throat tighten. What about him? Lucas hesitated. Just for a second. Then, has anything ever felt off? Her pulse kicked up. What do you mean? He studied her, choosing his words carefully. Strange phone calls, people asking questions they shouldn't, anything that made you feel like you were being watched. A chill ran through her, but she shoved it down. No, she said, but the word felt heavy, uncertain. Because the truth was, she had felt it before. That nagging feeling that someone had eyes on her. The landlord who asked too many questions. The job interview that fell through for reasons no one could explain. The times she had caught someone staring just a little too long before looking away. But she had brushed it off. Because who would be watching her? Apparently, someone had been. Lucas straightened. If they knew about Ethan, she didn't let him finish. They don't. She had spent years keeping Ethan safe, keeping him away from everything that could have dragged him into the chaos of Mark's absence. Lucas nodded, but his jaw was tight, like he didn't quite believe it. We can't risk it, he said finally. If Mark was running from something, we need to assume it didn't stop chasing. We. Julia barely processed the word before he was moving, grabbing his phone, making a call she couldn't hear. She should have pushed back, should have told him that this wasn't his problem, that she had spent years doing just fine on her own. But had she? Or had she just been lucky? Because if Lucas was right, if someone had been looking for Mark, for his son, then luck wasn't going to be enough anymore. The line clicked as he ended the call. Julia swallowed hard. What now? Lucas looked at her, gaze steady. Now? He said. Now we find out who the hell took Mark out. And just like that, there was no turning back. Julia didn't remember leaving the office. 1 minute she was standing in front of Lucas, and the next she was on the street, her thoughts racing faster than her footsteps. Mark was running. Mark had known, and someone, somewhere, had never stopped looking. She pulled out her phone, stared at Ethan's name in her contacts. Safe. He was safe. But for how long? She needed answers. And she wasn't waiting for Lucas to find them. She went home, dug through every box, every drawer, every forgotten place where she might have shoved pieces of the past she didn't want to look at. Old letters, receipts, the hospital bracelet from Ethan's birth. Nothing. And then an envelope, sealed, with her name written in Mark's handwriting. Her fingers shook as she tore it open. Inside, a single piece of paper. Julia, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. You were never supposed to know. She sucked in a breath. I was in something deep, and I couldn't pull myself out. I thought I had time. I thought I could fix it before it touched you. I was wrong. Keep Ethan safe, no matter what. No signature, no explanation, just a warning. Left behind by a man who had run out of time. A knock at the door made her jump. She turned, heart hammering, hands tightening around the paper. Lucas. She didn't need to ask how he knew where she lived. He was the kind of man who knew things. But right now, she didn't care. She shoved the letter at him. Read it. He did, and when he was done, his expression was grim. He knew, she whispered. Lucas nodded. And he died trying to stop it. She didn't ask what, not yet, because she already knew the real question. What do we do now? Lucas folded the letter carefully, setting it on the table. Now, he said. Now we stop running. The next few weeks were a blur. Lucas moved fast, too fast for Julia to process most of it. Calls were made, people were found. Information was dug up from places that weren't meant to be found. And the truth came together, piece by piece. Mark had been caught in something bigger than himself. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe the right place. Just long enough to learn something someone didn't want him to know. And he had spent his last days trying to fix it. Julia didn't know whether to feel angry or heartbroken. But in the end, it didn't matter. Because Mark had been right. The past had never really let go. And now, neither would they. The night it ended, Julia didn't feel relief. Not right away. Lucas had handled it. She didn't ask how. She didn't want to know. All that mattered was that Ethan was safe. That whatever had been following them, whatever had taken Mark out, wasn't coming for them. And for the first time in a long time, she believed that. Ethan was asleep when she got home. She stood in the doorway, watching him, feeling the weight of everything that had almost happened, everything that could have happened. She thought about Mark, about the choices he made, the ones he never got to make. And for the first time, she let herself miss him. Lucas was waiting outside when she stepped onto the porch. She didn't ask why he was still there. Instead, she sat beside him, staring out at the quiet street. After a long moment, he spoke. I never got to say goodbye to him. She nodded. Neither did I. Silence. Then, Ethan should know, Lucas said. One day. She exhaled slowly. Yeah, she agreed. One day. They sat there, both of them carrying ghosts that no longer chased them, but would never quite leave. The past had nearly destroyed them. But tonight, for the first time, they had survived it. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.